everybody. Welcome to another episode of Speaking of the Arts. I'm your host, Mike Epstein, and I'm excited to tell you about today's episode. We're featuring Joel Pierson. Joel is the founder, band leader, arranger of an ensemble called the Queen's Cartoonists, and I'm really excited to tell you about this group. The Queen's Cartoonists perform music from cartoons. Joel had this great idea to combine his passion for animated film and live music to create a really unique experience for audiences. So he's cultivated over 100 years worth of animation from all around the world and has largely by himself transcribed the scores to these films and then put together a great ensemble to perform them. So there's a couple of different versions of the show that we talk about. One is simply called ages 2 to 102. So the idea that this program is really for all ages, and it's a lot of fun. The other version of the show is a holiday program, which has a singer. Again, all animation with live music, but obviously focusing on holiday content. Then there's a version of the show where they feature international cartoons, and then there's another version of the show that is the ensemble with cartoons with symphony. So it was really fun to talk to Joel about how he came up with the idea for the ensemble and some of the things that audiences can expect during a performance. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Joel Pierson of the Queen's Cartoonists. Thank you. All right, Joel. Well, welcome to Speaking of the Arts. I'm really excited to talk to you today and have everybody listening learn all about your background, the exciting things you're doing, everything about the Queen's Cartoonists, and, the sky's the limit. So maybe by way of introduction, if you want to just give us a little bit of your background, how you came to do what you do, and then ultimately we want to get into the formation of the ensemble and talk more about them.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm a pianist and composer. I studied classical and jazz music, ultimately classical composition or contemporary composition or whatever. But I've always had a knack for music entrepreneurship and starting projects or little companies or little ideas, and the weirder and more unique the better for me, because there's space for things like that. And I love like coming up. What I really like about music is less the performing exactly, and it's really the entire process of coming up with a unique idea and then executing it. So everything from finding musicians and writing music and practicing music and performing and doing, the PR and hustling to find work, everything together that's really what I enjoy the most about music. And regarding the Queen's Cartoonists, I had a moment about 10 years ago where I realized I wanted to start a project from scratch. Every 5 years or so, maybe give or take, I do this, and I have a list of ideas. I call it my harebrained ideas list. And on that list, it just said jazz plus cartoons ? And I don't know when I had added it or anything, but I was like, all right, I'm going to pick that one. And there was a bunch of options I could have chosen, and that's the one I picked. And I, as I sort of, sat on it and thought about it, I was thinking, like, is there some sort of crossover between the golden age of jazz and the golden age of animation, which were kind of happening at the same time? And were there composers who were writing film scores for animated films that loved jazz, or were there animation studios that loved jazz and were working with jazz musicians, or was there what was going back and forth between these two very unique American art forms? And kind of realized that there was a lot of stuff, but wasn't something that people were really talking about. So that's kind of how I started the band, is thinking about these two things and pulling some musicians together to see if they wanted to play my arrangements. I was like arranging old cartoon soundtracks, for like a small jazz ensemble, and that's kind of how we started.
Tell me a little bit about the guys in the group. How did you meet them?
Yeah, so I had just gotten back to New York after like a long hiatus, and I didn't have a lot of connections, and I've never been very good at the like showing up to the jam sessions and hopefully people get your number and call you kind of thing. That's just not my forte. So uh, I only knew one of those. One of the guys was a friend of mine I had worked with, and then another friend of mine said, "Oh, you're looking for a clarinet player, call this other person." And then he called a friend. So it was really, I showed up at a first rehearsal. I only knew one of those people, but the band is all the same people that were there at that first rehearsal.
Hey, that's good.
Yeah,
I don't know that that
chalk it up to
usually
good
happens.
management, good management or whatever, good band
Yeah,
leading. I don't know.
no, that's awesome. I want to have you talk more about the specific programs that you guys do, but before we do, I'm very curious. What are some of the other things on the harebrained list you just mentioned?
Oh yeah, well, it's a pretty top secret list, but I'm happy to share a couple of things that definitely will not happen. And then, if someone else starts them, then congratulations. I had this idea of starting a group that would be like an Elvis cover band because I feel like Elvis impersonators and that's like a thing, but it's like not a thing. I don't think it's a thing anymore. I mean, I don't know anyone who listens to Elvis's music who actually goes to see Elvis impersonators. So I thought it'd be funny to get like to do some kind of band where you have three Elvis impersonators of different. They have to, like male, female, like different ethnicity, like just they all kind of look like Elvis, but they look really different from each other. That was the idea, and they would only do Elvis's religious music because he had this thing kind of like religious catalog that was a little different than the pop catalog. And I just thought that'd be really funny, and it'd be something you would do. Just find like the weirdest venues, with a lot of like choreography. I don't know. I was going to call it Triple Elvis, but it's that didn't make the cut. I'm glad it would be fun. I think it'd be fun. I also thought about opening up a wine store. Like when people that like wine, but you really have to know a lot about wine to really be able to like tell the difference between. You have to be like a sommelier to really know. So I thought it'd be a wine store, but only wines that were like really unusual, like things you'd be like, I remember that one. Like anyone with no training or not a great palate would really. So I was going to call it extreme wine, like with an X. But anyway, these are not great ideas, but they're those are ideas on the list that are definitely never going to happen. So
It
I
tells
renounce my
me,
claim to them.
it tells me there's a lot more to you than meets the eye, is what it tells me.
That's what it is. That's what it is. This is what my
Um,
mother said. I was a very creative child, I guess. So
I admittedly don't know much about Elvis, never really got into his music,
yeah,
but obviously a lot of people did and are still into his music.
I
So,
guess so.
who's to say you shouldn't workshop that idea and see if people are interested in that? Why not?
Right. Well, part of pulling something off the harebrained ideas list is saying, well, where are you going to do this, and how are you going to make money? How are you going to make money doing it? I don't
Yeah.
really see a super viable path with the Elvis thing, or at
Yeah,
least not to like profitability. And it'd be a lot of work because you'd have to really, really learn that material and really get a band together that wants to play it, you know.
right. Sure. All right. I'm glad you mentioned the list in general. I'm gonna now I know to ask you about this every so often to see what's coming.
Sure, sure.
So, all right. Let's talk about some of the specific programs that Queen's Cartoonist performs. Why don't we start with the ages 2 to 102 program, which is the bread and butter of what you guys do and tour. Um, tell me a little bit about that. What do you want people to know about that particular aspect of what you guys offer?
Yeah, well, as the idea came into fruition, I started to realize that a lot of classic animated films were in the public domain, and that we could show the films, and we could edit the films, and we could do whatever we wanted to the films. So at that point, I realized that this idea might actually be a stage production and not like a jazz concert exactly. It might involve more than just putting a set list on the grounds and improvising with musicians, which is wonderful. But this, I think, was going to be different than that. So I started looking for, like I started picked every kind of like classic character, like Popeye, Betty Boop, Casper, uh, Daffy Duck, all these characters, and was like, well, what films do they have that I could work with without having to have some kind of licensing agreement? And of those films, which one or two has a soundtrack that is most in line with what I'm trying to do? Either with like some jazz in it, or or some classical music. A lot of, especially the Warner Brothers films, a lot of classical music. And then, can I put those things together? And what would that look like? Sometimes it was taking a pre-existing score and just arranging it note for note for the ensemble. And since there's no music for this, you have to transcribe it and then arrange it and then sync it with the film. So it's a bit of a complicated process. Sometimes there'd be parts of the score that I wouldn't want to use, so I would write something new. Or sometimes I would just throw out the score entirely and write something new from scratch. And then sometimes we're taking the film and cutting up the film to a pre-existing music that I just want to play, on stage. So there's like a number of different kind of solutions to every film. And with that, we had something of a show. We had something we could screen films and play the music, and it was okay. This is the basic concept.
It's a multimedia extravaganza full of humor and joy.
But the music was very difficult, especially for the horn players. In a normal jazz ensemble, let's say you have three horns, like we have three horns, and the trumpet player takes a solo, and the other horn players generally just stand there, and watch the trumpet player. And then the tenor sax player solos, and the trumpet player gets to rest. I mean, that's great, but that's not what I want to do. I really wanted something that was more, everyone's interacting all the time and a little more, through composed than that. So the horn players are playing all the time, but they still need rest. So I started essentially telling stories about the films and the composers and telling jokes and just doing a little bit of like shtick in between the numbers so that the guys would have, 30 seconds to a minute between each number to rest before they had to jump back in and play, nonstop for 5 minutes, and that would be kind of the pattern. And I found that I really liked doing that, and the audience, responded to it. So we started adding a little bit of like a comedic kind of element to the show, and then I kind of wanted to push it further. So I would, find out anything unusual that the band members could do, any kind of stupid human trick kind of thing, and then I would add that into the show. And essentially, we started adding clowning to the show. So, for example, one of the guys one night told me he could solve a Rubik's Cube really fast. Like as a kid, he learned all the algorithms and he went to competitions or whatever dorky stuff he did. So then I was like, great, we're going to put it in a show. We're going to put it in the show. And they all laughed because they're like, there's no way you're going to put a Rubik's Cube like speed run into like a jazz concert. And I was like, watch me. So we did. So we have this number where he actually plays the saxophone and solves the Rubik's Cube at the same time. But his hands are busy, so he holds the saxophone, and then one of the other guys goes behind him and puts his arms around him, and does the keys, and then he solves the Rubik's Cube. And so I added it. I used the music from Jeopardy, and I rewrote the lyrics to be about about how he could solve a Rubik's Cube really fast, and then he does it, and it gets a big response from the crowd because no one's expecting that kind of thing. And it's just so goofy, and it's also a way to really feature musicians in a way that shows their personality, as opposed to like, look how fast he can play, how complicated or how advanced his language is, his musical language. It's like, oh well, you're really going to remember that this is the guy that does this thing, and this is part of who he is. So that musician gets a chance to improvise. He gets solos, but he also gets a couple of moments to really showcase sort of more quirky sides of his personality. And that is, of course, something that you don't typically see in jazz and classical music.
Right.
those kinds of that kind of clowning or whatever. And so so the show really came together as here's some old films, here's some contemporary films as well, and then here's some comedy, and then here's some you know sort of like variety. It's almost like a vaudeville kind of thing, a little bit or something. So that is the ages two to 102 in a nutshell. And with all these different elements, we're essentially trying to reach the the biggest audience we can. I think all jazz musicians and classical musicians can get frustrated if they struggle to reach certain age ranges or like demographics, and the music is not always as popular as it was 60 years ago or whatever. And our way to rectify that is to really say, oh, you may not like jazz, but you like cartoons, right? Or like you could bring your grandkids because they get to look at these films. Or even like, well, but you've never seen someone solve a Rubik's Cube and play the saxophone at the same time. So we sort of build these elements, and I really think of it as like a way to make a bridge to the audience, so that if they are, not used to going to a concert hall or not used to going to the theater, they can really see something that they can connect with, and so we kind of just throw all this stuff at them, and hope that it sticks.
That's great. In that particular version of the show, how many cartoons are you guys playing with? Like,
Mhm.
what's the sort of pacing structure of the
Yeah.
show?
Yeah, I think there's I mean, it depends because we changed it up a little bit. I think there's about 18 films,
Okay.
and I would say it's maybe, let's say, 10 classic films now, and then maybe 8 contemporary films. We found that people actually respond better to the contemporary films than the classics. Like they'll say, "Oh, I grew up watching Betty Boop" or something like that. But then after the show, if they come talk to me, they'll, no one, very rarely does someone say, "I love that Betty Boop film." They usually say, "I loved that film from wherever, Argentina or Iran," or we pick films from like really unusual, not unusual, but places you wouldn't expect to see.
Yeah.
And that tends to be what people will comment on as opposed to the classics. So that's kind of why we kept adding in those films, because it's like, well, we still want to market the film as majority classic animation, but we really find that people like the contemporary films more. And I think that's just the like just it's just like if it's from if the film is in a different language and you've never heard of it before, but it was made in our lifetimes, there's just like a cultural or different kind of thematic elements, and connection that people may not realize they have with those films.
Right. Right. That's interesting. And roughly the runtime of the show is it like 75 minutes? Is it 90 minutes, give or
We
take?
do, yeah, we do 80 minutes straight through, or we'll do if we take an intermission, we'll do like a couple more films, and it ends up running about 110, 115 minutes. Yeah, we never want to go too long. But we've done enough of these now. We have kind of like a pacing that we think works. But yeah, we'll never go more than 80 minutes straight through because it'll just kill the guys, or we'll never go past 120 minutes ever. So more like 110. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the International Animation Spectacular. That's a
Yeah.
version of the show you guys do. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that I love that name. I had to do this show once called the Piano Spectacular, and it kind of went totally sideways, and so we called it the Piano Craptacular, is what we called it inside. And I realized I probably couldn't get away with calling this show the International Animation Craptacular, so we call it the Spectacular. And that is essentially all contemporary films. Just we'll do like one or two classic films, but it's basically all contemporary films, from around the world. It's a little more serious. Like there's still some goofy moments, but it's really kind of a celebration of culture and animation around the world. So we have films from every continent, every inhabited continent at least, and yeah, it's sort of like expect the unexpected. Like you're not there to be moved by some piece from Colombia or something, but then maybe you see it and you think it's really beautiful, that kind of thing. And there's some American films and there's a couple of Canadian films because they have great animation history up there. So, but yeah, it goes just all over the world, and there's more original music in there. Like I've written more other scores because we talk to like when I engage with filmmakers that are still alive, I'll tend to give them some options and say, well, here's the music that's in your film. I'll probably need to adapt it at least a little bit because there's no way that the original soundtrack is the exact same instruments that I have. And so sometimes I'll say, well, could I write a piece, and then we'll rehearse it and we'll make a video for you with the new score and the film and see if you like it, and so there's definitely a little more original music. It's a little more of a jazz show, I think, just because if I'm writing original pieces for this kind of jazz ensemble, it's gonna feel a little bit more like that. And yeah, there's a little less clowning and stuff, but there's still some pretty silly moments for sure. I think it's a really fun, really fun program. It's very funny and serious. Moments that are like some of the films like, why would someone spend so much time making this? With this film, it's like a fish, like a real fish. It's like a stop motion film. It's a real fish that is singing this tragic aria. I think it's a Donizetti aria as it gets from the grocery store into a frying pan, and it sings this thing. And, and people, they love it. It's so funny, but then there's some really serious moments too.
Yeah, that's great. There's also the symphonic version of the show. Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the symphonic show is essentially the ages 2 to 102. We lean a little more into the classic characters. So that one is the most of the classic characters, since a lot of those old cartoons had, full orchestral soundtracks. So I didn't really I wanted to really keep as much of that as possible. And yeah, it's got orchestra, it's got some, we kind of make the orchestra do some ridiculous things, in the middle, like, stand up, dance, do this, do whatever. But yeah, other than that, it's pretty similar to the normal show.
Yeah. Let's definitely talk a little bit about the holiday program. What could people expect from that?
Yeah, so the holiday show is interesting because unlike the other presentations, people have expectations for a holiday program. They expect to hear holiday music that they know and they can either sing along with, or they can say, and that's a very limited number of pieces that you musically that you can present. There's let's say 20 or 25 Christmas carols that are skew, a little religious, 20, 25 that skew very secular. And you can only do a couple religious ones because you don't want to, exclude anybody. So you mainly have to do your Frosty the Snowman and, these kinds of things. And that's kind of what people want to hear. So you can't have them expect to hear that and then show up and then they get nothing, like that. So there's also quite a bit less animation out there that's holiday themed. So it was a tricky thing to put together to balance all those kind of expectations. But it is a fun show. I decided to do a bunch of like Spike Jones, like old Spike Jones numbers, because he was a great entertainer in the 50s and 40s and 50s that people don't really think about too much anymore. We have a vocalist for that show, so the kind of vocal stuff is covered. There are some serious moments, to be like, okay, everyone wants to hear White Christmas or whatever, and we're going to do it without, farting around on stage or whatever. But we dip into those and we dip right back out. We really want it to be a fun experience still, and not too cheesy or we don't want to lean into the expectations too much either. You don't want, because we want to be creating an interesting piece of art, and we don't want to be pandering toward a crowd that is expecting a certain thing, and so we give them exactly that. We're not interested in meeting someone's expectations exactly. We just want to be sort of playing with this genre, and personally, I don't think holiday shows are really tough to sit through sometimes because it's exactly like that. So we are trying to keep it interesting and fresh. There's definitely a lot of Foley, a lot of like percussion, on stage. In every show we do some sound effects work for the films, but in this one we really lean into it, and there's a lot of moments, and that's fun to see the band do that stuff. And yeah, the singer, she sounds great. She comes out, in like a ball gown and like roller skates and like roller skates around while singing, and all these kind of just little fun things we like to do.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the recordings the Queen's cartoonists have. Can you talk a little bit about Mozart's Jazz Requiem? And then
Sure,
are there plans for another album release? So kind of
sure.
a two-part question.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as we started really figuring out what this project was going to be and what the show was going to be, I realized that making albums was not the focus of what we were doing. Like, it's important to have recordings as musicians, but this is a multimedia extravaganza here. And if you're just making recordings, you don't have the visual side. And so the music that we're preparing for concerts is really not meant to be listened to in a sense. It's meant to be experienced with the video, right? So you can't just take the numbers that we do on stage and pull the video out and release it as an album. It would be just very disjointed, and it just didn't make a lot of sense. So once we really got the show going and we were touring and stuff, I was like, all right, now let's think about what would make sense as an album that would still kind of be true to what we're doing. And so since we do a lot of classical music and kind of a jazz style and a lot of like this kind of uh, frantic, energetic 1930s kind of stuff, I had the idea of doing Mozart's Requiem as sort of an upbeat, swinging jazz piece with like some sort of humor baked into the arrangements. So that's what we did, and we made some videos for the movements that are paired with animated films, and we're working on a stage version which would have all animations with the music. And yeah, like there's little funny bits in the music. I put some Beethoven in there, some Beethoven quotes, just if anyone caught it. And we had one reviewer in Germany was going to review the albums and he didn't like it because he didn't understand why there was Beethoven in the Mozart. I was like, well, hey, that's great. You caught my little joke or whatever. So there's stuff like that, and we got a couple guest musicians in. It's incredible xylophone. He's like a ragtime xylophonist, and we got him to come in and do some pieces. And yeah, so that's the album, and we sometimes we'll perform a movement or two in the show, but it's definitely its own thing. And then as for upcoming, we are working on a second album, and it's still kind of in formation. But the two composers that we play the most music from are Raymond Scott and John Kirby, and they're both kind of 1930s kind of outsider artists a little bit, like in the jazz world, but doing things that were a little odd for that time. And Raymond Scott was very famous, John Kirby a little less. So I wanted to make an album essentially of arrangements of Scott and Kirby that we could put together. And they wrote a lot of they use a lot of classical music in their pieces, and they also wrote a lot of like kind of quoting here like exotica, like here's a piece of music about Egypt, here's a piece of music about France or Switzerland, even if they'd never been there. So the concept for the album is essentially these two composers go on vacation, and we're featuring all their pieces they wrote when they kind of traveled around. And it's not fully fleshed out yet, but that's going to be the idea.
Nice. Do you have a rough sense of when you would like for that to come out?
I would, well, yeah. I mean, I know what I'd like to happen. We'd like to record it in the next 6 months, and the charts are maybe 75% done. It's just about really hammering them out, and making sure we have the money to do it, or to do it correctly. So I feel cautiously optimistic that we'll get it done in the next 6 months. Yeah.
Great. This has been great. I just have a few more questions. Uh,
Yeah.
so you guys have been doing this for about a decade. When you kind of look back over this experience, as a band leader, what are some of the things you feel like that have stood out and you've really learned from this whole experience?
Well, the first thing is that I really found the right musicians for this. I mean, they've been dedicated since day one. As soon as we started doing theaters, it was like, all right, we got to memorize all this music. And they were like, okay, let's do it, and that was a huge, huge task. They just have been committed. Like I said, they were at the first rehearsal and they're still there at every show. I mean, we hardly ever, no one ever subs out, they just do the shows. And the bands I'd been in my 20s were like rock bands where, everyone pulls together and you essentially start a little unit and everyone has to do everything, and you're not just calling people to come in for a gig. It's like, no, this is the thing. You can't. And that's kind of how I've run this from the beginning. And I was straightforward with the guys saying, I'm not interested in having like 8 tenor players and I'm making calls and hoping they show up on time. It's like, I want one person, and we can achieve so much more as a unit if we work that way. And the guys were just totally, totally invested in that. So that's been the best thing, and you can tell when we have, if we do have someone come in as a sub or something, I, always give them like a talk of like, hey, just so you know, like this is how this works. Like, no one's saying this has to be perfect, but like, please look at the music ahead of time. Well, and sometimes people don't do that because they're used to just like, yeah, what tunes are we going to play? Like I know this tune, that's whatever. And people that think that way and come into this gig, they really struggle. They drown. And it's not that every single piece of music is so difficult. It's that when you start to string it together for 2 hours, it's like people's brains get full and then they start making mistakes and they struggle and stuff like that. So I've been just totally happy with how the guys in the band have handled everything. So that would be my big takeaway, and also I gained a lot of confidence in myself over the first couple of years from being like, I'm in New York, I have no work, I don't really know that many people. I know my limits as a jazz pianist, and they are great compared to some other people. Like I'm not that skilled, relatively speaking, in that world. But then realizing, well, but I do. My package is very unique. That I have a lot of training in composition and write music for people and arranging and playing piano and kind of all the other weird stuff that is in my personality, so kind of coming together and being confident in my package, that took a little while, but the more I lean into that confidence, the better things go. So
Yeah.
that's where I'm at.
Great. So I guess last question, looking ahead the next few years, what are some of the things you hope happen with the ensemble? I know we just talked about the recording works, but what kind of gets you excited about working with this group going forward?
Yeah, I mean, the best thing for this group to do is just a tour, because people when they see the thing live, that's when they love it, you know. And so the best thing for us is just to tour and go back to communities and go to new places and engage with people. We love doing shows for kids. We've talked about how we might do an evening show that is like moderate success, but the venue's hired us for a student show, and we get 1,500 kids, and they go absolutely crazy. The next day kind of thing. We love that kind of outreach, and we excel at that. So yeah, it's really just doing shows, going places, doing shows. It'd be fun to have more albums, of course, and that will happen. But what really gets me excited is working on new films, incorporating them into the shows, and just going on the road and doing them.
Yeah. So on that note, let's mention just a few places where people can see you guys. We're recording this mid-August, and you guys have a couple of shows coming up. You've got, I'm looking at the link you sent me. So on September 28th, people can come to Scarsdale, New York at the JCC MW. I'm not, forgive me. MW is it's Jewish community. What is the MW?
I think it's Mid-Westchester.
Okay.
Yes,
If people go to jccmw.org, and we can put a link to this in the show notes. You can find information about this show. Also, if you go to the Queen's Cartoonist website, you can see some stuff coming up. Is there anything else I should mention before we wrap
No,
up?
I mean, we're excited about doing SF Jazz in November, so that's a highlight. And yeah, that's it. We're always happy to see people when they come.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much for your time, Joel. This has been great.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much for having me.
You got it.